Hello, and welcome to Your Art Sucks, a podcast that continues the fight against mediocrity in all forms of art. And this is episode 5, Poisonous Love, Francis Bacon and Pablo Picasso. In this episode, we will look at the troubling lives of these artists to uncover the abusive and deadly relationships that impacted their lives and the lives of those they loved. This is going to be a bit of a disturbing show, so please take note. Some of the content in this episode may be hard to listen to. But I want to assure you that there will be a lot to take from these artists that we can use in our own processes, and more importantly, in our own lives. So let's begin. In the previous episode, Against Odds, I talked about Christy Brown and how the supposed love of his life, Mary Carr, may have led to his physical decline and premature death. Christy's brother is quoted as saying, Christy loved her, but it wasn't reciprocated, because she wasn't that type of person. If she loved him, like she says she did, she wouldn't have had affairs with both men and women. I feel she took advantage of him in more ways than one. Now, this is a one-sided opinion of a relative who was, rightly so, impacted by Christy's death. But what we need to know is that, due to neglect, Christy died from choking on his dinner. It was a terrible end for someone so full of life and with many years of gifts still yet to give. In that same episode, I also mentioned that the movie about Christy, My Left Foot, ended on a very high note with the portrayal of Christy and Mary as a couple deep in love. All seemed roses, and then the credits rolled. The reality, sadly, we know was not the fairy tale ending we all long for. And this reality got me to think about artists and relationships. Specifically, it had me wondering if there were artists who were negatively impacted by those that claimed to love them or who they claimed to love. Surprisingly, there are countless cases of musicians or authors or actors who've been manipulated or abused or had their careers derailed by jealous, overbearing partners. But as we will hear in this episode, this cuts both ways. Artists have also been the one who've dispensed toxicity to anyone within arm's reach. And the more successful the artist, the more we hear of the ruined lives that they've left in their wake. From the instances I've read, it would be a fascinating movie, if not for the real lives that were destroyed. The reality is that such pain and suffering is much more depressing. While this episode will be one that may be haunting, I know each of us have experienced relationships, whether from family, friends, or potential partners, that have caused us much grief or distress. Depending on how deeply rooted the pain is, there are a few of us who would not channel this baggage into our work. It is, for most artists, a false source of creative energy. This may seem cliché to some of you, but it's painfully obvious that too many artists rely on negative love to spur them to create works overflowing with emotion and force. I'm going to cover this in more detail at the end of the episode, but I wanted to state now that any artist who thrives off negativity for their inspiration, anyone who uses others, drains their energy to supplement their own, will only end up void of creativity. Such vampirism is a one-way stream, and once that stream dries up, it leaves the artist vacant and vacuous. Think this is hyperbole? Well, how about we begin looking at the unsettling life of our first artist, Irish-born figurative painter Francis Bacon. Born in Dublin in 1909, Francis Bacon was named after the famous ancestor and noted English philosopher of the same name. Son of a military father, Anthony, and a socialite mother, Christina, Francis was a child who experienced torment at an early age. When Francis was determined to have asthma, a condition he would have all of his life, his father lost interest in the young boy as he viewed him as weak. Francis would not be following in his father's military steps, and, with his father's interest in raising horses on a farm, this worsened Francis's condition. These perceived inconveniences led to an underlying disappointment and anger towards Francis from his father. Sadly, this parental disassociation and disapproval wasn't limited to the paternal side alone. His mother, an ardent socialite, which stemmed from the family having to move quite often to accommodate the military needs of Anthony, also had little time for Francis and his siblings. She spent her time in the company of influential locals whom she felt could benefit her and her social standing. At a young age, Francis lacked any deep connection to those who should have focused their love and attention on his well-being and growth. Fortunately, there was one who would return the love to Francis that he so craved, and that was his maternal grandmother, Winifred Supple, or as he called her, Granny Supple. She held a strong contempt for Francis's father, as she witnessed the lack of contact and the unapproving looks his father failed to hide. What's unclear, though, is if she knew about the whippings Francis endured at his father's hands. You see, Anthony had suspicions about Francis. He felt something, to him, just wasn't right with the boy. He was far too delicate and too feminine. And with rumors of a young teenage Francis engaging in unspeakable acts with the stable hands, Anthony was growing furious. His reputation as a strong, stoic leader was being threatened. The final straw came when Anthony caught Francis trying on his mother's underwear when he was 16. He was immediately expelled from the home. Francis, with no clear idea of what he wanted to do, went to London. During the autumn and winter of 1926, he simply drifted. He was kept afloat by a modest £3-a-week allowance from his mother, a series of odd jobs, and some covert encounters with older men. Now, Francis would recall, he would say this, he said, "I can't say I was what's called moral when I was young." And he certainly had few qualms about engaging in petty theft or rifling through the pockets of a casual pickup. There was no guilt associated with his actions. He saw his movements as a means to an end, and maybe the idea of being caught again spurred some sense of excitement in him, but who's to say? In some deranged sense of parental duty, Bacon's father made one final attempt to influence his son's life, and, like all their other interactions, it was exceedingly inept. Anthony arranged for Francis to be accompanied by a friend and relation of his wife's side. This older boy was named Harcourt Smith. On a trip to Berlin in the spring of 1927, Anthony hoped that with this ultra-masculine Harcourt Smith, he would help iron out some of Francis's effeminate behavior. Now, sadly, instead of that happening, Harcourt Smith took advantage of Francis. This was something that Francis would recall with considerable mirth later in life. Now, even if, in time, Francis believed this was nothing detrimental, which I'm not convinced he was, we see yet again that those charged with Francis's care disregarded his well-being for their own selfish needs. Abuse, it would seem, has become entangled with his perception of love, and it would prove to be a factor throughout the artist's life. It would, as we will hear, present itself in his work and, tragically, culminate in the death of one of his lovers. But let's step back a bit. There are two interactions Francis had with works of art from other artists that left an indelible mark on him and his progression into the art. The first occurred when he was in France and witnessed the work of artist Nicolas Poussin. The Massacre of the Innocents, painted in 1628 or 1629, depending on who you reference, is a graphic work indeed. This painting, which references the biblical actions of King Herod's command to kill all infants to prevent the coming of the Savior, shows the depiction of a soldier with his foot on the neck of an infant, his sword drawn high in the air with one arm, and the other pulling back the hair of the mother who cries out in horror as she tries to protect her child. Now, I've put an image of this work in the show notes on the website, but I can tell you that it's difficult to look at. I can't say for certain what about this piece struck Francis the way it did, but I have my guesses, as I'm sure you do too. We could look at the early impact of violence in his life as an indicator, but for me, I think this piece shows more than violence. I think it shows a mother's horror at the loss of her infant, a mother whose soul is being torn from her as she spares nothing to try and prevent it, despite the little power she wields over the soldier. Now replace that soldier with Francis's father, Anthony, and the picture for me is complete. We see a young Francis who craves the undying love of his mother, and he's looking for protection from that soldier who constantly has his hand raised to whip him or to give him cruel looks. Now, am I drawing too many conclusions here? Maybe so, maybe not. While the Massacre piece may have subconsciously resonated with Francis and will guide his artistic vision, it didn't push him to make art. He seems to have considered becoming an artist only after attending an exhibition of drawings by the other artist in this episode, Pablo Picasso. Now, he saw these works at the gallery of Paul Rosenberg, and that was in the summer of 1927. There was a collection of varied drawings from Picasso's early period, a lot of imaginative work, like pencil drawings and line work, and they seemed to strike a deep chord with Francis as he began immediately making drawings and watercolors himself. Apparently, he had nobody guiding him. He was just so inspired by Picasso's work, he wanted to get right to it. Now, despite some early successes, many detractors surfaced and quickly robbed him of all momentum. He didn't have any training, and he didn't have that formal side to really tell him what was good and what wasn't. Now, in the 1930s until the mid-1940s, it was just a tumultuous time for him. His work stifled, and whatever he produced, he quickly destroyed it. Little survived of this period of his life. I believe only 15 pieces exist, which is quite sad. But after a non-military stint with the air raid precaution sector in World War II, Bacon was fully renewed and ready to put his fervor once again into painting. Bacon said if it weren't for his discharge from the army, due to his asthma, he would have never been a painter. Now, recognition quickly gathered for Francis. His work and its contorted images of figures in pain, or his 1953 work titled Two Figures, which shows two nude males entangled together, which caused quite a scandal, and pushed his name onto the lips of the talking heads of the art world at the time. With this success came the introduction to many people in and around the art world. One person in particular, George Dyer, would be the focus of Francis's life and will lead to his greatest loss. While Dyer would pose for Francis and appear in many of his works, it was the relationship that would become a greater focus for the world. Meeting in 1963, Dyer was a petty criminal and with a tough look that belied a depressive and insecure nature. Their relationship was one that bordered on pathological. For Francis, he had someone who needed him desperately. Dyer was a raging alcoholic who displayed severe symptoms of depression. There were times when Dyer attempted suicide out of some need for attention or possibly due to a mental condition worsened by his addiction to alcohol. Either way, Francis was taken in completely. Like the painting of the Massacre, here we have an addictive personality in full-on destructive mode, clinging to Francis for his every need. Dyer was the needy infant, and alcohol and depression were the soldier ready to strike him down, and Francis was the screaming protective mother. It was wholly dysfunctional, an emotional car crash that, in many darker times, led to physical altercations that left bruises and scars that Francis proudly wore them. You see, this wasn't the first time lovers had beat him up. Previous relationships had gone so far as to even leave him unconscious in the street. So pain and suffering was no stranger to Francis. Some say he actively sought them out. And here we see yet more evidence of an unresolved childhood trauma manifesting itself in very negative ways. As for the impact on Bacon's art, well, the highly charged emotional power that radiated from these relationships was very evident. His paintings depicted contorted figures who seemingly scream out in pain and anguish. Many of his images are like still frames from horror movies or depictions of a person's nightmare. However disconcerting these images were to the gallery goers, the recent violence of World War II was fresh in everybody's mind, and these works spoke to that. No one could look away. But the emotional well that Bacon had been stealing from for the sake of his creativity would soon look to steal its power back. In 1971, when Bacon was at the peak of his career, Dyer and Bacon attended a retrospective of his work in Paris. At this time, Bacon had grown tired of the repeated cries for attention and Dyer's fake suicide attempts. Dyer knew he was slipping away from the picture, and he decided that he would take this time to cry out one last time. But this time would be one time too many. On the eve of the show, Dyer would overdose on barbiturates in the bathroom of the hotel room. For 2 days, the death was kept secret from the public, and Bacon continued to meet his social obligations for the gallery. Now, obviously, a secret of this nature couldn't be kept from the public for too long, and Bacon's torrid life would be exposed for the world to see, bruises and scars as well. While Dyer wouldn't be the last partner Bacon would have, as the years before his passing in 1992, Bacon's long-term friendship with John Edwards would be a source of comfort and inspiration for him. It appears that in the final act of his life, Bacon was shown true dedication and devotion from a close friend, which allowed the artist to display works that showed a real sense of calmness never before apparent in his life. To me, Bacon's life was filled with a longing for parental love that was intermixed with the notion that violence was a means of positive expression. His works were a violent reaction to the negative energy that devoured every aspect of his life. For a time, he was able to harness this energy to produce brilliant work, but his reliance on it eventually took its toll. While research would suggest that he was a willing participant in these relationships and in the violence, I fully see him as an enduring victim in a never-ending war for affection. To contrast Francis Bacon's unfulfilled desire for unconditional love, I offer the poison love of Pablo Picasso, dispensed to many of his lovers. In his own words, Picasso considered all women as either goddesses or doormats. And those doormats? Well, once he was done with them, they were left vacant and tortured enough to fall into madness, or more alarmingly, take their own lives. I'm going to spare all of us a historical review of a young Picasso, as, unlike Francis Bacon, there was nothing in his life that would trigger his wildly ranging views of women. While Bacon's father was continuously disappointed and practiced corporal punishment that was steeped in his military background, Ruiz, Pablo's father, he was an accomplished artist and teacher, and he was very involved in his son's life. He believed that his progeny was superior to him in painting and drawing skills at a really young age. Ruiz would push for Pablo to have early entrance into elite art schools, and he moved throughout Spain to get his child the training he felt that could benefit him. The only impact of such admiration, in my amateur opinion, could have provided a young Pablo with an overinflated sense of talent and confidence, which he used to hold others in contempt. There are many accounts of Pablo berating teachers and associates and eventually leaving art school due to his belief that he could learn nothing from the teachers there. By the age of 16, Pablo's defiance was deeply entrenched in his psyche. He decided that he was better on his own and struck out into the world without his doting father in tow. Now, historians love to categorize periods in artists' lives, and for Picasso, due to his lengthy career and progressive methods, this was more than evident. In the early years of his painting, labeled as his modernist period, Pablo was influenced by Toulouse-Lautrec and Edvard Munch, but soon this period would give way to his famous Blue period, which lasted from approximately 1901 to 1904. Now, this period was really interesting. Outside of the predominant use of blue, hence the name, the subject matter routinely depicted the poor, and interestingly for this episode, prostitutes were also evident. One could draw the conclusion that during this time, Pablo was quite poor and may have been exposed to the poor and to the women of the evening in his travels to the apartment he shared with his friend and poet, Max Jacob. With no income from his work, possibly from being too proud to be a mindless laborer, he would have to burn his artwork to stay warm. These were depressing times for him, and the suicide of his close friend Carlos, who shot himself due to an unrequited love of a woman, only deepened this experience. The impact of this loss on Picasso may never be known. What we do know is that Carlos would be the subject of a painting titled La Vie in 1903. So here we have two instances in Pablo's life where his initial perception of women would be challenged. We have his first visual acknowledgement of prostitutes, of which he is known to have had sexual encounters with, and which ran counter to his upbringing where dominant pious women were the norm. And the second one would be the loss of his close friend due to his friend's over-enthusiastic affection for someone who didn't entertain such romantic interests. But there would be circumstances that would alter Pablo's depressed view of the world and lead him to his more inspired period, noted as his Rose period. It was during this time that he met his first real love. Fernande Olivier was a French artist who ran in the same art circles as Picasso, and in 1904, their fiery relationship would take its first form. You see, Fernande was far from a pushover. She held the same prideful streak Picasso did, and together their relationship overflowed with passion. In the 7 years they lived together, they would come to periods of violence as the jealousy they both exhibited made its way to the surface. On the creative side, Picasso was brimming with energy and enthusiasm that resulted in countless paintings and drawings, and also crafted one of his most famous works, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, in 1907. In his painting, Fernande is noted as having the prominent placement. She's the main female in the middle. But in spite of these tumultuous times, Fernande felt that a family could be the next stage in their cohabitation. In an attempt to push this idea forward, Fernande adopted a 13-year-old orphan girl named Raymond, and she moved that girl quickly in with both of them. While the notion of having a family was inspired, it quickly led to disaster as Fernande found explicit drawings of Raymond Picasso had completed. Upon this discovery, she immediately returned the girl to the orphanage. It was the end of a dream. As Picasso's success grew and his artistry morphed into new forms of cubism, the split in their relations widened to the point of Fernande leaving and taking up with an Italian artist in 1912. Now, this greatly angered the jealous Picasso, to the point that he pursued an immediate relationship with Fernande's close friend, Eva Goul. But this was not meant to last. Eva sadly died from tuberculosis. While he was apparently devastated by Eva's passing, this didn't stop him carrying on a simultaneous affair with another woman named Gaby de Peyre. Not long after this, Picasso met and married Russian dancer Olga Kuklova in 1915. This relationship had an impact on the art of Picasso and led to a complete reversal in his artistic direction, from world-changing abstraction to the relatively conservative neoclassicism. It was clear that his many relationships in his life entirely fueled his creativity and spurred him to produce countless works. Yet, just as Picasso's artistic restlessness couldn't be contained for more than a few hours, so the desire of the socially ambitious Kuklova to tame the now wealthy artist soon began to suffocate him. As the relationship disintegrated, and she became increasingly delusional, his depictions of her, and women in general, grew ever more hateful. He showed tortured masses of teeth and limbs distorted and quite grotesque. Picasso would go on to a string of affairs, while not separating from Kuklova, out of some sense of Spanish traditionalism and her respectable social standing. Some of these affairs he kept private, like the 7-year dalliance he had with Marie Walter, who was 17 at the time they met. Others he flaunted outright, like the fascination he held for the rebellious Dora Maar, who was caught by Marie with Pablo and led to a physical altercation. It was a memory Picasso would recall with fondness, calling it one of his choicest memories. It further fed his now insufferable ego and insatiable need to keep drawing in new women, younger women, to fill his rapidly emptying creative pool. When Pablo moved on from Dora Maar for a much younger François Galland in 1943, Maar suffered a complete mental collapse, and then she followed it with nun-like seclusion. After Picasso, she famously declared, "There is only God." And it appears that the devotion and emotional support she provided Picasso left her completely void and unable to cope with a life without him. After bearing him a daughter, Maya, in 1935, it would be in 1977 that she would commit suicide, the cause of which can only be speculated. But in 1940, Picasso was still Picasso, and he was on to the next interest. Another emotional crutch he abused to prop up the depthless hole that had become his artistic identity. Unlike Dora Maar, though, François Galland was a young, aspiring artist, just 21 when they met. She seems to have handled Picasso's cruelty and perversities with amazing deftness, and was the only woman to leave him of her own volition, with her dignity more or less intact. François bore him 2 children, Claude and Paloma, with whom they lived in a relatively normal family for 9 years. It appears that Picasso was, to a degree, domesticated. But Picasso would have one more cruel twist for Francois, a sharp stab at her for having the nerve to leave him. And it would be another level of emotional torture. Pablo, now in his 70s, met Jacqueline Rourke. She would be Pablo's last love. But in 1954, it would result in Picasso's second marriage. But the marriage itself seems to, at first, been nothing more than a vicious action against Francois. You see, Francois was already married and eventually convinced by Pablo to divorce her husband so Pablo could marry her and claim their children as rightfully his. The problem was that when Francois was finalizing her divorce, Picasso secretly married Jacqueline Rourke in 1961. This premeditated act permanently damaged his relationship with his children. But Picasso was unfazed, and he would continue to use people with whatever needs struck him from moment to moment. Now, he could be sincere and loving, but as most of us have heard, he was more inclined to be petty and jealous and vindictive. His career was lengthy, only ending when he was in his 90s, and his volume of work was counted in the thousands. His ability to take and take and take from the loves of his lives was unsurpassed in the art world. He was the equivalent of a creative vampire who empties everything essential and continues to exist in spite of the carnage left in his wake. And in the end, Jacqueline, she wasn't spared either. You see, Picasso died in 1973, but the lasting effect he had on her just wouldn't be silenced. Devastated and lonely, Jacqueline Rourke killed herself by gunshot in 1986 when she was 59 years old. So, there we have it. Two artists who sought creative inspiration through destructive means. With Francis, we see a tortured individual who sought love that was cruelly denied him by his parents. With Picasso, we see an insatiable need to squeeze every emotion from his lovers, and when he's done, he moves on to the next. Regardless of these methods of abuse that existed in their lives, their art was undeniably legendary. They shaped the world of art for decades and spawned movements that still reverberate to this very day, and no one can deny that. But what do these tales of twisted love mean for you? How do their poisoned relationships manifest into your creative processes? To answer that, I would have to say that this episode is most effective to you as a cautionary tale. A clear example of how the abuse of people and emotions as powerful as love and jealousy can result in pain and suffering that can span generations. It is, to me, what's wrong with artists who rely solely on external sources to replenish their creative juices. There's not a doubt it's a one-way process that becomes nothing more than a craving akin to the withdrawal from narcotics. Now, drug addicts, they call this chasing the dragon, an all-consuming effort to find a high that equals that of the first time. Both artists featured on this episode, in the end, were nothing more than emotional junkies. Maybe all of us, to some degree, are in need of egoic fulfillment from others. And just maybe the end result of that need is the eventual hatred of ourselves for seeking such approval, which leads us to destroy this love in a vain attempt to preserve what's left of our pride. We all know that most artists are lauded for their destructive personas. Charles Bukowski, a fine example of destruction, said it best when he said, "The way to create art is to burn and destroy ordinary concepts and to substitute them with new truths that run from the top of our head and out of the heart." But I argue that to have destruction as your muse is to spark a fire that will consume you and your work. Anais Nin wrote this truth that perfectly encapsulates the 6 cycles she observed with fellow artists. She says, "I often see how you sob over what you destroy, how you want to stop it and just worship. And then you do stop. And then a moment later, you're at it again with a knife like a surgeon." So now ask yourself, are you reliant on the blood of others to create your art? Is your passion only stoked by the conflict and negative emotions that come from dispensing pain and suffering either on yourself or others? If you answered either of these questions with yes, then you're on the wrong path, and I implore you to move to a more sustainable and holistic model. These inflamed passions you so desire, while they make great art and give you a perceived artistic depth, they're but flash fires, and they extinguish themselves far too quickly to draw any real originality from. They are false gods that you pray to, and no matter the level of your sacrifice, you will always be left at the altar on your knees. Let me leave you by one more quote from author Rachel Carson that may point you in the right direction. She says, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we have for destruction." Well, that's it for this episode, and I hope that you were able to draw something from it. I know it was difficult to hear, and it was difficult to write, but I was really interested in exploring this concept with you. Let's hope that each of us finds a means of replenishing ourselves that doesn't require pain or suffering. I wanted to talk a little bit about the podcast here. I just want to say that the podcast has been #1 in the US iTunes Store in the art category numerous times in the past month, and it's just surpassed over 30,000 downloads. This is something I can honestly tell you I never expected, but it's providing me with just a lot of joy. I'm so honored to have all of you listening, and the reviews and sharing your podcast with your friends has been amazing. Now, stop listening to me and go build a lasting love that will fuel your career for decades to come.